Hello, I'm Shelley Klein, the historian and director of education at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. Thank you for joining us tonight for Perspectives on Liberation, the second in our Auschwitz speaker series offered in support of the exhibition Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. Tonight's program is sponsored by Union Station, Kansas City, and the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education in partnership with the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum and the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum. Tonight, you'll hear from three of our panelists. Jessica Rockhold, the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. She holds degrees in History and Museum Studies. Jeffrey Nelson is a member of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum Curatorial staff and has a master's degree in History from Kansas State University. Mark Adams is the Education Director from the Truman Library Museum and has worked there since 1997. He's developed history education programs for both the Kansas Museum of History and currently the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Mark has degrees in history and secondary education from the universities of Wolverhampton and Liverpool in England. He is a past president of MCHE. Thank you all for joining us, and I now turn it over to our first panelist, Jessica Rockhold.
Thanks, Shelley. First of all, thank you all for joining us, and my particular thanks to Mark and to Jeff. These are partnerships that MCHE really cherishes with the two presidential libraries, and we're so pleased to be able to offer tonight's program. As Shelley said, this is offered in support of the exhibition Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. And though the exhibit is very specifically about Auschwitz, it covers virtually every aspect of the Holocaust. And in the spring, our thoughts always turn to liberation and the aftermath and what happened to our survivor community as they come out of this experience. And so tonight we thought it would be interesting to share with you three perspectives on that major event and how that carried those people forward through the next several months or even a year or so after the Holocaust. And tonight I'm going to be speaking to you about the survivors and how they experienced this. So as Americans, our perspective is very much based on American liberation. And we think about places like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and Buchenwald, places within the interior of Germany, where there was an experience of Jews who had come there late in the war, but not where the final solution had happened. And so I want to just take a moment to set that context. As the war shifts, as Germany begins to have to fall back into the interior and is losing the edges of its furthest reach. The Soviets are pushing in from the East, and the Americans and the British and the Canadians are pushing in from the West. And we actually see very early liberations in the East. As early as July 1944, the Soviets have reached the death camp of Majdanek, and they've reached some of the former sites of killing centers at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Those killing centers had been closed down and they were no longer operational, but they liberated those spaces. And you can see here just a brief perspective on where those fronts are at a given time and some of the major complexes that they're coming across as liberators. And I just want to give you this visual to get us started. The only major death camp that was still operational when it was liberated was Auschwitz-Birkenau. And in January of 1945, the decision is made by the Nazis that they are going to evacuate as many living Jews as possible back into the interior of Germany. And this is where we get the phenomenon of Jewish prisoners being in those interior German camps. Those were not camps that were designed to house them. And it is unusual in the scope of the Holocaust that Jews are in those camps. That begins in late January and early February 1945. And it's essentially an evacuation. They're evacuating the East. They put the Jews out onto the road in winter conditions with very little provision, and they march them to train depots where they are then placed on open cattle cars and sent into these camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. So that when these first liberations happen at places like Majdanek and Auschwitz by the Soviets, it's a very different experience of liberation than it is in the West. It's happening in the context of full-blown war. This is a fast-moving front. These are active duty military people coming across these camps. And what they're recovering is more the evidence of the crime than it is survivors of the crime. So for instance, in Auschwitz, tens of thousands of prisoners are evacuated and approximately 7,000 are liberated on the ground in Auschwitz. So they're really not taking over very many people that need care, but the people they do encounter, the Soviet army is not equipped, nor is it interested in providing very institutionalized support for the survivors that they come across. That is very different than what happens in the West with the Americans, the British, and the Canadians. In this case, these are camps that have been overrun with numbers that they cannot control. And so when the Americans and the British and the Canadians arrive there, they're arriving there in the context of the end of the war. Their fighting is essentially over, and they're encountering enormous numbers of very ill prisoners that need very substantial care. They are prepared largely, and they ramp up their systems very quickly to provide that institutional support that we come to think of as the post-war experience. So for most people, for most learners, they're thinking about a Western experience of liberation. And as Western liberators, the Jews are encountered both in camps, but also in the course of progressive death marches. There was a great deal of chaos at the end of the war, and prisoners were being moved around camp to camp. Some were liberated on the road, some were liberated in trains, and it's a real variety of experiences. Just to give you a sense of how complex the situation was, we're going to look at an example of Bergen-Belsen, which was liberated in April of 45. It's a camp that was holding 60,000 people by that April, and it was designed to hold 11,000. And you'll see here that just the number of unburied bodies located in Belsen on that date exceeds the capacity of the camp in its normal operating conditions. So what that meant is that disease had run rampant, that starvation was out of control, and that the prisoners were truly, truly ill. So what does that mean for the Jewish survivors? What does it mean to be a survivor? We often reach the point of, we've taught about the Holocaust, we've taught about liberation, and survivors will say things to us like, it was my second birthday, it was the best day of my life, I kissed my liberator. And then that's often where we as learners stop listening. And if we take just a moment longer and give them a moment to go further, there's the sadness behind liberation. This is the moment when they are able to stop focusing on immediately surviving. It's no longer, where will I get a piece of bread? How do I stay warm enough to live through the night? Some of those basic needs are going to be cared for. And so they are now turning their thoughts to the enormity of the experience that has happened to them. What is it that they have to deal with and cope with psychologically? What is the situation around them that they now find themselves in? So first of all, they literally had to regain their health. We have several local survivors who tell stories of being severely injured on their liberation day. We have survivors who tell stories about how the liberation was imminent and I passed out and I woke up several days after liberation. We have one survivor who understood that the liberation was imminent and was afraid that he would be shot as they were working to liquidate some living witnesses. And he disguised himself in a pile of corpses, and his body was numb when his liberators arrived there. And he literally had to find a way to regain the strength in his body to signal that he was there and that he was alive. And so these issues with their body become the very first obstacle. How do we regain our strength? How do we eat appropriately to nourish our bodies back to health? Having achieved that, the paramount concern of survivors is the search for loved ones. In most cases, they had been separated at some point in the East. It's very rare that they are still with their loved one in a camp in the West. These are some of our local survivors who did find their loved one after the war. But this is a very difficult process. This is war-torn Europe. This is a system where it is very difficult to communicate, to say nothing of the stress of the Jewish survivors who had no real method of tracing where their loved one had gone after they had been separated. One of my very favorite stories, the couple here on the left, she was in a DP camp, and he learned from a list, from a Red Cross list, that she was in another camp. And he decided he was going across Germany to find her. And with the help of an American policeman or an American serviceman, he got a bicycle from the Germans, and he bicycled across war-torn Germany to get back to his wife. For others, they didn't know where their loved one was, and so the best option for them was to try to return to their homes after they had regained strength. And for most of the Jewish community, that meant going back into Eastern Europe, which was now under Soviet occupation and was, again, across war-torn Europe, where there isn't infrastructure to deliver them back home. And so these are images just to give you a sense of how fraught that journey was. It is difficult to gain passage back to the East. And once arrived back at home, they were met with anti-Semitism from their former neighbors, people who accused them of only coming back to try to reclaim valuables, people who, for no other reason than straight anti-Semitism, said, you know, we don't want you here. Why aren't you dead? That is literally something that survivors heard when they returned to their home villages. So it was a very difficult situation, but many did try to go home to locate loved ones and to potentially rebuild their lives there. All of this is happening, again, in the context of war-torn Europe. And what that means is that surviving Jewish Holocaust survivors were not the only displaced persons. There were displaced persons from every country in Europe, and that institutional support that I mentioned came from the Allied Expeditionary Force. The Americans and the British set up displaced persons camps in their zones of influence, and they were meant to house and feed and nurse back to health people who needed it, and to provide homes or temporary homes for people who had been displaced. What that meant for the Jewish DPs is that they were now being housed among millions of other homeless people who had not had the same wartime experience that they had had. And it was a very difficult and tenuous situation for them. I'm not going to belabor this because I believe that our other panelists are going to speak to this very significantly, but the Americans in particular addressed this issue very quickly. And it's recognized that the Jews have suffered something singular, and that they are going to need separate housing and separate circumstances in which to rehabilitate and rebuild their lives. And so the camps are reorganized in the summer of 1945. What that means for the Jewish perspective on all of this liberation and this post-war rebuilding, is that they now focus on rebuilding community. They don't have a word for themselves. They don't have the word Holocaust. They don't call themselves survivors. They call themselves Sheharit HaPleitah, which means the surviving remnant. And they want some very specific things out of their post-war experience. First, they want autonomy. They had just come through an experience where no matter what decision they made, it didn't lead to a result that they chose. And what they wanted was to set their own course and to have that ability to chart the Jewish path forward. That meant civilian administration of their own government within the displaced persons camp. That meant everything from the highest government official to policing. They held elections. They lobbied for the rights that they wanted and for broader political issues in the broader world. So for instance, for access to a Jewish homeland in Palestine. They set to catching up not only their young people who had missed all of their formative school years, but to figuring out what the path forward would be in terms of vocation. So if this group of Jewish survivors wants to go to Palestine, they may take an agricultural course because they understand that that's going to be their livelihood in Israel. Whereas people who were intent on moving to America maybe looked at other professions to move their progress towards that immigration. They reestablished their culture to the degree that they could. It was not what would have been. The Jewish communities as they had existed in Germany and Poland and Hungary and throughout Europe, that was destroyed. But they picked up the pieces that they still had and they moved forward with those and rebuilt their cultural lives. They made family out of each other. For most survivors, they end up being potentially the only survivors of their family or of their entire community. And they have lost generations on both sides of them. They've lost their grandparents and their parents, and they've lost the younger generation. So predominantly, Jewish survivors are late teens to early 20s. And so the displaced persons camps become places that just buzz with life. There's a great deal of social life and community. They find their partners there. These are some of our local couples who paired up. And it's not uncommon to find people who potentially met and married within the space of a week or a month. These were very fast-moving relationships. Again, these are some of our local survivors celebrating their marriages to other survivors in these displaced persons camps. And what results is a really significant baby boom. They are reconstituting not only their community, but very specifically their families. It's within this context where the Jews that have remained in Germany are building their families, that the Jews in the East become aware that it is no longer safe for them to remain there. There was a pogrom in Kielce, Poland in July of 1946, in which the Jews who had returned to that community were murdered as part of a blood libel accusation. And in response to that, there is an incredibly significant wave of immigration back into the West that is facilitated largely by the Jewish Brigade in Brica. This is a largely illegal movement of Jewish survivors back across the Soviet border, back into the American and British occupation zones, where they then swell the numbers of those displaced persons camps. It becomes a very thriving and active community. And ultimately, those survivors remain in those camps only so long as they need to in their quest to leave Europe. It's very important to the survivors to find a path out of Europe and to reestablish their Jewish families elsewhere. One path that is very desirable is to go to Palestine, not yet Israel. Israel isn't formally formed at this point, but there is a great deal of illegal immigration attempting to reach Palestine through British blockade. And there's a great deal of lobbying the British government attempting to establish a Jewish homeland there. And then the other path, of course, is America and sometimes Canada. And here you see some of our local survivors on their boat trips. These two pictures on the left are our local survivors on their way to America. Sometimes they're rejoining a loved one there, maybe a relative who had immigrated before the war, or maybe they are truly coming alone. They're just starting completely new, a new language, a new homeland, looking to rebuild their lives. And in Kansas City, that community comes to call themselves the New Americans. And I'm going to leave this here with Bronya Roslavovsky, one of our local survivors. In many cases, the survivors came to a major port, someplace like New York, where they were met by an aid organization that told them something along the lines of, you're not staying here, you need to move on into the interior of America, into another community. And several of our local survivors tell stories of looking at a map and not knowing where Kansas City was, what that meant. That community didn't necessarily ring a bell to them. They hadn't heard of it in Poland or Hungary or Germany, but they knew Truman, and he was a touch point for them, President Truman, and that this was near his home. And that was a very significant and resonant point for our local community. So with that, we will take questions later, but I'm going to turn this over to Jeff from the Eisenhower Library to now share a bit about the perspective of our service members during this time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. In April 1945 was when American and Allied troops on the Western Front first started encountering concentration camps. They had been fighting on the continent through France and the Low Countries for almost a year at this point. On April 12th of 1945, Generals Dwight D. Eisenhower, George Patton, and Omar Bradley were touring an area in Germany near the town of Gotha, which is in central Germany. Their first stop of the day was at a mine in a small town called Merkers. Any of you who are from Kansas and have been to Hutchinson, it's very similar to the salt mine in Hutchinson. There they descended 2,000 feet underground and viewed the entire German gold reserve, which the Third Army had captured, which also included a huge cache of art and precious metals that had been confiscated from persons who had been sent to the concentration camps. The next stop of the day, which this picture is showing, was decidedly less exciting for them or pleasant. Eisenhower and his entourage visited the concentration camp at Ohrdruf. The camp at Ohrdruf was a fairly small, primarily a labor camp. It opened in 1944. It housed up to 20,000 total people during the entire time it was open. Estimates state that nearly 7,000 of those prisoners died while working at the camp. Several days after the three generals visited this camp, Omar Bradley related a conversation with Eisenhower in his diary. Eisenhower was discussing orders he had given for all local Allied troops that were not engaged in combat to visit Ohrdruf or other camps. Ohrdruf was a sub-camp of Buchenwald. He was discussing this order with Bradley as to why he was giving it. And Bradley quotes Eisenhower as saying, "We are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now at least he will know what he is fighting against." Eisenhower's visit to Ohrdruf, which was liberated 6 days earlier by the Third Army, and his follow-up visit to Buchenwald had a profound effect on him. In fact, you can kind of tell the effect it was having on him in that photograph. Having worked at the Eisenhower Library for many years now, I think in this photograph is the single angriest look I have ever seen on Eisenhower's face. Ohrdruf was one of at least 239 camps that were reported to exist in an undated SHAEF report, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force report, which estimated that when the war ended in May, up to 500,000 survivors of the Nazi systems were housed in these camps. The numbers of both living and dead were quite shocking to Eisenhower. The evidence of brutal atrocities that were discovered led Eisenhower to create several orders. His initial response was, as I said, to make sure that as many American troops as possible saw what was happening in these camps. He wanted as many eyewitnesses as possible to bring this story back to the United States. He also ordered local German populations to view the camps. Many of them denied knowing what was going on, so he ordered that they would find out. So that was his attempt to make sure the story got out, moving down the chain. He also made an attempt to make sure the story got out moving up the chain. On April 19th of 1945, he sent a telegram to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, who was one of the few in the military that was his superior, and informed George Marshall of his discoveries. He felt strongly enough about what he saw to encourage the Chief of Staff to send congressmen and reporters into an active military theater to document what was being found. In fact, the document listed here is that telegram he sent. We continue to uncover German concentration camps for political prisoners in which conditions of indescribable horror prevail. I have visited one of these myself, and I assure you that whatever has been printed on them to date has been understatement. If you would see any advantage in asking about a dozen leaders of Congress and a dozen prominent editors to make a short visit to this theater and a couple of C-54s, I will arrange to have them conducted to one of these places, where the evidence of bestiality and cruelty is so overpowering as to leave no doubt in their minds about the normal practices of the Germans in these camps. So Eisenhower, he laid out his reasoning in a letter, which he had written actually earlier to General Marshall, but would have arrived in Washington, D.C. after General Marshall had received the telegram. And he discussed visiting Ohrdruf and talking about how the things I saw beggar description. While I was touring the camp, I encountered 3 men who had been inmates, and by one ruse or another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room, where they piled up 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did. And then the quote here is the end of that paragraph. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in position to give firsthand evidence of these things. If ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. Okay, so very early on, Eisenhower understood that what was being discovered, and keep in mind that the US military knew these camps existed prior to liberation. What was shocking to the military from general all the way down to private was the horrific atrocities that they discovered when they did liberate them. In researching for this paper, it's kind of my conclusion, as Jessica mentioned, most of the camps that the Western Allies liberated did not have large Jewish populations. They were generally considered political prisoner camps. So Ike was already envisioning denial, but I don't think he was envisioning a future anti-Semitic Holocaust denial, partly because the term had not been coined yet. But I think he was envisioning denial because what had been discovered was so horrific that he felt that any rational and moral human being would be hard-pressed to believe that any such thing could ever happen. Then I'm, whoops, change slides here. There we go. Now I'm going to finish off. I'm going to step down from kind of the high officer history and go down to the impact liberation had on regular soldiers. This is part of a series of letters that Harold Porter, who was assigned to the 116th evac hospital, wrote to his parents starting in early May of 1945. The 116th evac hospital was assigned to the concentration camp in Dachau. They had landed in southern France and moved north. And when Dachau was liberated, they were assigned to work there. The Army actually assigned 2 full evac hospitals, the 116th and the 127th, to work at Dachau. His series of letters to his parents is eye-opening, to say the least. It's, as you can see, written on letterhead that he must have personally liberated from the Dachau commander's office. And he opens his letter to his parents kind of as follows. He informs them that the dates are going to be a little off because they're not allowed to say where they are yet, and the Army's still deciding when they'll be allowed to write home about what they're doing. And then in the second paragraph, he says, "It is difficult to know how to begin. By this time, I have recovered from my first emotional shock, and I'm able to write without sounding like a hysterical, gibbering idiot. Yet I know you will hesitate to believe me no matter how objective and factual I try to be. I even find myself trying to deny what I am looking at with my own eyes. Certainly what I have seen in this past few days will affect my personality for the rest of my life." So the soldiers interacting with these survivors are struggling very, very much to actually believe that they're seeing what they're seeing with their own eyes. These 2 evac hospitals, the 116th and the 127th, are normally designed to operate at a level of about 400 to 450 beds per hospital. So roughly 900 patients at a time they can treat. When they got Dachau, they quickly realized they had to expand that. Quickly, we have around 36,000 potential and eventual patients here. The end of the work for everyone else is going to be just the beginning for us. Because keep in mind, early May in 1945 is the end of the war in Europe. The Germans surrender in early May. The staff of these hospitals, the military staff of these hospitals, realize that they are not going anywhere for a long time because they've got so many desperately ill people. American and Allied troops were profoundly affected by the horrors that they found in the camps. When the war in Europe ended, there were still hundreds of thousands of survivors trying to become healthy in these camps. It was a task of immense proportions. I'll just leave this to say that I kind of intentionally, most of the primary source research that I did for this came from online documents that we have. So if you want to read the full letters from Harold Porter, you can. And they're quite shocking. So if you want to read, jot down that URL, and you will see what we have online. There's many more documents than I use. There's several documents from the post-war era dealing with how Eisenhower and the Supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force tried to deal with taking care of hundreds of thousands of displaced persons. And now I'll pass it over to Mark.
Thank you, Jeff, and good evening, everybody. Before I go into my presentation, I want to thank Jessica and Shelley for coordinating this panel and putting this together. I really appreciate the partnership, both with Jeff and the Eisenhower Library and with the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. So thank you for the opportunity. My presentation, as we're talking about different perspectives, is going to be from the executive level and that of President Truman. And so let me share my screen. And so far, our technology has been working just fine. So I'm going to jinx that. And there's the three sponsors there, and I'm trying to get my screen to load. Here we go. It's going to be black for a while. I've noticed in practicing that it takes a few seconds for the slides to load. So again, thank you, Jessica and Shelley and Jeff. My perspective is going to be about Harry Truman. I'm going to keep talking until the screen loads, and his role as the chief executive, as president, as liberation takes place. And so there you see you should be able to see that now. And then there's the three nice logos there. And we're going to start in April 1945 has been mentioned a couple of times with some of the liberation. But as we're talking about perspective, Truman's perspective is very different. And it's a good contrast. April 12th, of course, 1945, Truman becomes president. And this is the photograph from that time. It's 8 minutes past 7 in the evening. FDR has died earlier that day in Georgia, about 3 in the afternoon. Truman is rushed to the White House and sworn in there, takes the oath of office in the White House. And in that same week, you heard from Jessica and from Jeff, liberation of camps is going on the Western Front, both by the United States and by the British forces, right in that same time frame. I believe Jessica said Bergen-Belsen was April 15th, and this is April 12th. So all of that is going on all at the same time. And it's part of what I want to try and get across to you today as Truman becomes president, and he's receiving this information about liberation and really about the war in Europe winding down. All of these things are happening all at the same time as he becomes president. As you know, he's only been vice president for 82 days since the inauguration in January. And in those 82 days, he's only met privately with President Roosevelt twice. Kind of astonishing. So he's kind of out of the loop. He's not really out of the loop about the situation in Europe and the concentration camps, and he's aware of those. He's been a senator for 10 years. He's been pushing as a senator, actually, for increased Jewish immigration. But now, of course, he's the chief executive, and so his responsibilities change. So we move swiftly into May, and what I'm going to do is kind of go through the rest of the calendar year, 1945, and how he responds to the situation as it unfolds. So in May 1945, on May 8th, what we now know as VE Day, we have the German surrender that Jeff just mentioned was coming. And so May 8th, and just happens to be President Truman's birthday. He makes a statement to the nation and to the world. And what it really gets across for our topic tonight is that he really focuses on Adolf Hitler. And he's conscious of the price we have paid to rid the world of Hitler and his evil band. Of course, it's a much longer statement. But as the war in Europe ends, you know, his attentions, of course, are going to switch to Asia and in particular to Japan. But for our topic tonight, he's also receiving information about the liberation of the camps and what the situation looks like there as the Allies take over. So that's kind of what's going on for him in May. One of his earliest decisions in April is actually to attend the creation of the United Nations in San Francisco. He's asked if he would still go to that conference that FDR had set up. And so in June, you see him here at the podium in San Francisco in the photograph on the right, where he is addressing the creation of the United Nations. They're going to come play an important part a little bit later in the year as we look at what happens with the displaced persons. Also in June, more relevant to our topic, it seems at the moment, is that Joseph Grew, who's the acting Secretary of State, asks Earl Harrison to go to Europe to determine the needs of Jewish and other displaced persons. So reports are already coming back, similar to those that Jeff mentioned from Eisenhower and from the other military on the ground, about the situation with displaced persons all over Europe, as you saw from Jessica's map at the beginning. Grew recommends to Truman that he signs a letter expressing interest in Harrison's mission. So that elevates its importance. And Truman actually personally requests a report of his findings, which we'll see here in a moment in August. Of course, as I mentioned before, Truman has got lots of different things going on, and he's got the war in Asia now to contend with. And in July, he meets with Stalin and Churchill at the Potsdam Conference in the suburbs of Germany. So actually, he takes tours of Germany, particularly of Berlin, but at other cities too, where he sees some of the devastation. Now, he does not see the displaced persons camps specifically, but he does see the ruins of the German cities while he is in Germany meeting with Stalin and Churchill. And of course, as you know, at the same time in New Mexico, we have the first successful test of the atomic bomb at Alamogordo, New Mexico. All at the same time, all of this is happening. Of course, Stalin and Churchill discuss all kinds of matters while they're at the Potsdam Conference, but particularly what to do with Germany and what to do with the refugees all across Europe, amongst many, many other issues. One thing that's going to come into play while he's at Potsdam that's going to be important in the fall is that Winston Churchill actually loses the British general election that summer, leaves the Potsdam Conference, and is replaced by the new Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who we'll see some correspondence with about the displaced persons issue and immigration a little bit later on. So all of these things are intertwined. In fact, when he's back in the United States in August, after he's dropped the atomic bomb and after Japanese have surrendered, he's asked this question in a press conference, which is a good segue from him being in Germany in July. And he's asked, what was the American view on Palestine at Berlin, referencing the conference at Potsdam, which was a suburb of Berlin. And President Truman's answer is, the American view of Palestine is we want to let as many of the Jews into Palestine as possible to let into that country. Then the matter will have to be worked out diplomatically with the British and the Arabs, so that if a state can be set up there, they may be able to set it up on a peaceful basis. I have no desire to send 500,000 American soldiers there to make peace in Palestine. Now, if you think about this document and this answer to a press conference question, it's kind of remarkable. Here we are 3 years before Israel is created as a nation in 1948, and Truman is already talking about letting as many Jews into Palestine as possible. He recognizes that, of course, that still have the British mandate at this time, that they're going to have to diplomatically work things out with the British, and of course with the Arabs as well that are in Palestine already. But he doesn't want to go to war over it. So this is kind of the policy that he follows actually all the way through to 1948, but he expresses that in the summer of 1945. So it's pretty remarkable that he has his policy kind of set out right from the very beginning of his tenure. We move into the second part of what's happening in August, and that is at this point, Harrison has visited 30 camps in Germany and Austria, and his focus, as we saw from Jessica's slide earlier, is that he really kind of draws out the Jewish experience from the rest of the people in the displaced persons camps. He focuses his attention on them, that they need preferential treatment, and this famous quote that is used quite a bit, both by Truman himself, actually. He uses it in letters. He pulls these sections from Harrison's report. And Harrison says, as matters now stand, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They're in concentration camps in large numbers, under our military guard instead of SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people seeing this are not supposing that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy. So a scathing report that Truman immediately reacts to. We see a letter. I'm not going to click on the document today, but you can go to that on our website. If we have time at the end, we could show you some of these letters. He writes to Clement Attlee, the new British Prime Minister, urging him to increase immigration into Palestine, which of course is under the British mandate still. Truman actually expected more favorable response from Attlee, and he's rebuffed. He was under the impression that he could convince Attlee to do this. And in fact, they have strong disagreements about the whole issue. We move into September, and Truman is writing to Jeff's subject, Dwight Eisenhower, and he is really concerned about the military and the way they're handling the displaced persons camps. Eisenhower initially doesn't necessarily agree with Truman, but eventually, after witnessing those displaced persons camps himself, they tighten up their policies there. The one paragraph that jumps out to me from this letter from late September is that he says, I know you will agree with me, we have a particular responsibility towards these victims of persecution and tyranny who were in our zone. You remember that Germany is divided into 4 zones. We must make clear to the German people that we thoroughly abhor the Nazi policies of hatred and persecution. We have no better opportunity to demonstrate this than by the manner in which we ourselves actually treat the survivors remaining in Germany. So very strong words. By October, this is where the United Nations comes in, that was just formed in June. So it's pretty amazing to me that this is already up and running, that we have the Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and they take over the administration of the camps in October. And Truman is really pushing behind the scenes, feeling that the military is not best suited for this. And they're, of course, supported by a number of American Jewish organizations that are listed there on the slide. By November, the British and the Americans have agreed to an Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, and which recommends 100,000 Jewish displaced persons come to Palestine. The British actually disagree with this recommendation, which is where Truman and Attlee exchange correspondence. And basically Attlee tells Truman, stay out of it. This is British territory or British mandate. It's got nothing to do with the Americans. And, you know, you can imagine that Truman didn't fare that very well. And of course, there's pressure in the United States for Truman to bring more people into the United States itself, which he's under some restrictions through Congress. Congress is not playing ball, as Truman would say. And so what he does in December of 1945, he issues what is essentially an executive order. It's officially called a directive, where he makes the statement and then a directive just before Christmas of 1945, where we're going to wrap up our calendar here, where he actually says that displaced persons receive a preferential treatment. So we don't actually increase US immigration quotas because Congress was not in favor of that. But he made sure that displaced persons receive preferential treatment at this time. Some displaced persons legislation comes out a little bit later, and that's modified a couple of times because it's quite imperfect. But this is kind of his first attempt. And so in the next 2 years, just under 23,000 displaced persons make their way into the United States through this directive. And about 2/3 of those are Jewish. And so that's where I will wrap up. And I think that timing is good. I'm going to stop my screen sharing if I can. There we go. And we should all be back and ready for questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, all of our panelists. Yeah, if anyone has a question, go ahead and type it in the Q&A. We have a couple in there already that I'll go ahead and ask. Jessica, could you speak maybe to the number of camps and the differences between the types of camps that were liberators encountered?
Right. I know it piqued my interest. I heard Jeff reference a SHAEF document where Eisenhower had given an estimate of camps. And that is something that Holocaust scholarship has really changed over the years. We now know that there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 44,000 camps throughout occupied Europe. So we think of the big camps, places like Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, but there were many small camps, many sub-camps. We think of them in terms of their function. So there are 6 death camps that are very specifically designated because their entire function was the murder of European Jewry. That is Helmno, Majdanek, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. Those 6 camps remain the 6 camps for that function and have a very specific designation. Then there are concentration camps, like the ones that were liberated by the Americans, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. These were camps that were really designed for political dissidents and people who were otherwise considered racially Aryan by the Nazis and might be re-educated and brought back into society. And then there are labor camps or forced labor facilities. Many of these were tied to larger systems. So we think of camps sometimes in terms of complexes. Auschwitz itself was a complex. It had 3 primary camps and then approximately 50 subcamps. So a slave labor facility would utilize not just Jewish slave labor, but sometimes other prisoners as well. And they would contract with the SS to bring those people into those industries and use them in service of promoting war aims or sometimes private industry. You're on mute.
Thank you. We have another one here asking about the number of Jews that came to the US versus Palestine versus staying in Europe. So I'll open that up to any of you that might like to comment on that.
That's probably a Jessica question. The truth is that we don't have good numbers on that. We do know that, and it's kind of anecdotal, honestly. There is an incredible interest among the Jewish displaced persons in going to Israel, and that I would say that in a pocket of time, the majority of the surviving Jewish community goes to Israel. America would have the 2nd largest Jewish survivor population, and then a very small percentage remained in Europe. That has fluctuated over the years. There are pockets of times when survivors go back to Europe and sometimes reconstitute their home there, but even to this day, it remains a very small Jewish community, and certainly among survivors, a very small community. So we think about more in terms of percentages and where people shifted their new home to, but we don't have good empirical solid numbers.
And I would just add to that there were many people who got stuck in Germany initially that wanted to leave and go someplace, but couldn't because of health issues or the health issue of, their loved one who couldn't, maybe they had TB and they couldn't get a clean bill of health to leave. So even those that end up getting stuck there, that wasn't necessarily their first choice, that they too may have had aims to go to Palestine or the US. There's another question about Soviet liberation, probably a Jessica question. So can you speak to how Russians today view the Holocaust and the Soviet role in liberation?
Well, certainly the Soviet view of liberation is that they were fighting fascists. So it is not that they are thinking about the Holocaust as a distinct event within World War II. Their aims are very much about defeating Germany, and it's an ideological clash between these 2 political systems. And the focus is not on the Holocaust. So you'll see things, especially early memorialization in a place like Auschwitz. that there is no mention of Jewish death, even though it is very specifically a Jewish, it was a death camp designed to murder Jewish victims. So there is a mitigation in Soviet memory of the Jewish experience, and they are really referred to as groups of by nationality. So rather than Jewish people from Poland, they were just considered Poles. The locations themselves are really repurposed in many cases. So sites that we might think automatically something really significant here happened, we need to preserve it. That's not the Soviet view. It could just become an army barracks the next time around. So it is not the way that Americans or the British approach Holocaust memory.
Thank you. Did anyone address maybe the anti-Semitism found within liberating troops and maybe commanding officers such as Patton?
The only thing I found in my research was a couple of reports pointing out that the initial liberating troops were heavily affected by liberation. But after the war ended and troops were rotated and new troops were assigned to guard these concentration camps that the Harrison report basically pointed out, the survivors are still there, and the only difference is the uniform of the guards. The replacement troops did not have that initial contact when the survivors were at their unhealthiest. And so they let their latent anti-Semitism show sometimes. I don't think it ever became a huge problem. I know Eisenhower did everything he could to mitigate it when he found out about it. But it was there, at least from the American side. And I think Jessica kind of pointed out fairly well how the Russians basically swept everything under the rug of fighting fascism. So
I think, Shelley, you mentioned Patton in particular. Patton was a known anti-Semite. He said some particularly anti-Semitic and vicious things in the post-war period about the Jewish DPs, and was specifically reprimanded by Eisenhower for that behavior. So he was a known anti-Semite, and the experience that he had in visiting these camps, which was a visceral one, he was known to have vomited in visiting a liberated concentration camp. So despite seeing this evidence and having this very strong response, it did nothing to mitigate his anti-Semitic views.
And I would just quickly recommend the book The Last Million to learn more specifically about some of the, the background on the Harrison report and the, what some of this anti-Semitism looks like. So, and putting it in context of what other military commanders are doing at the time. So, but definitely a troubling thing to take on. Jessica, could you also speak to the significance of flying a delegation to Germany in 1945? What is, I think we often think about in our world, oh, you can fly people anywhere, but how is that different in 1945?
I love that Jeff brought that document in. It's one of my favorite documents out of the Eisenhower collection to teach with, because it always strikes me how significant that is. This is a war-torn country. Again, this is a really significant thing to ask for a congressional delegation to get on a transatlantic flight. That was a treacherous trip at that time. It's an expensive trip. It's something, he's asking for something extraordinary here. And the request is very bold, and then the response is very bold. And I think it's a real moment where we can point to the American military and government taking ownership of something and doing something right, doing something that is ethically right.
Absolutely. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you all for joining us tonight for this discussion of liberation. If this topic of liberation and return to life of survivors is something that particularly interests you, as it must, because you're here with us tonight, I invite you to watch for the upcoming documentary called All These Delicate Sorrows, produced by Kansas City Public Television, that should be coming out mid-June, so watch for that. Tickets to the exhibition, Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, are on sale now. And we hope to see you next time at our next speaker series in the Auschwitz Speaker Series, which will be June 22nd, again at 6:30. Well, no, it'll be at 2:30, I believe. And it's for a historian, Tim Cole, who will be coming to us from England. And he'll be on Zoom. It'll be a Zoom presentation, and he'll be talking to us about Holocaust landscape. So he does really, really interesting work on geography of the Holocaust. So I hope to see all of you with us again on that day. And I bid you a good night.